I stood there, champagne glass raised high in the middle of a ballroom filled with 500 guests. Every eye was on me. They expected a proud, tearful toast from the mother of the groom. But what came out of my mouth silenced the entire room. You see, this wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. In that single moment, I wasn't just a mother anymore. I became the one person willing to finally speak the truth, no matter who it shattered. What drove me to ruin my own son's wedding? What secrets was he hiding behind that charming smile? And why did I choose that moment, standing among strangers, to reveal everything? If you've ever wondered how far a mother can be pushed before she finally chooses herself, stay with me, because this story, it changes everything. I'm Florence Mitchell. 64 years old, a widow for nearly 20 years. I spent the better part of my life wrapped up in a simple identity, a mother. It wasn't always easy. Life rarely is when you're raising 2 children alone. My husband Daniel passed away far too soon, leaving me to navigate the storm of motherhood by myself. But I wore that title proudly, especially when it came to my son Ethan. Oh, Ethan, my boy, my pride. I thought raising a son on my own was the hardest job in the world, but I believed I was doing it right. I ignored the warnings, silenced my doubts, and told myself I was building a man the world would respect. He was the light of my life, the son I pinned my hopes on. I remember the way his small hand would curl around my finger, how those innocent eyes would light up whenever I called his name. Back then, I never imagined that same little boy would one day be the source of the deepest hurt I had ever known. Madison, my daughter, was always different. Quieter, more grounded. She was the child who never asked for anything, who worked hard and made life easier for me. But I'll admit now with a heavy heart that I took her for granted. She didn't cause trouble. She didn't make demands, so I left her to figure out life on her own. Meanwhile, I bent over backwards for Ethan. Every scraped knee, every temper tantrum, every foolish mistake. Ethan had my immediate forgiveness. I'd make excuses for him, call it boys being boys, while Madison watched silently, swallowing her feelings year after year. Looking back, it wasn't fair, but at the time it felt natural. People told me boys need more attention. You have to make sure he grows up strong, Florence. And I believed them. I excused it when Ethan pushed Madison aside, shrugged it off when he forgot her birthdays or ruined her school projects. I told myself he'd mature, that someday he'd become the kind of man who would look after his sister, who would honor the sacrifices his mother made. Now, sitting in my room just days before Ethan's wedding, I wonder how I could have been so blind for so long. Outside my window, the spring air is filled with the sound of wedding preparations. It's supposed to be a joyful time. Yet my heart feels heavier than ever. Ethan is marrying Emma Wallace, the daughter of a wealthy real estate family. Their wedding is nothing short of extravagant, held at the Wallace estate with 500 guests, gourmet catering, live music, and enough flowers to rival a botanical garden. Everything about it screams wealth, status, perfection. But for me, it feels like being a stranger at my own son's celebration. The first cracks appeared during the engagement party months ago. I noticed how Emma's parents barely acknowledged me, how decisions were made without my input. Every time I offered to help, Ethan brushed me off. "Mom, you wouldn't understand the scale of this," he'd say with a dismissive chuckle. I smiled through it, told myself this was how things worked in high society. Mothers fade into the background, and the new family takes center stage. But then I started to see how Madison was treated. My sweet Madison. She wasn't even invited to the bridal fittings. She wasn't included in the planning committees or the family luncheons. When we arrived at the pre-wedding dinner, I was seated near the exit with distant relatives, while Madison was placed at a table so far back she could barely hear the toasts. I could see the tight smile on her face, the way her fingers twisted around her napkin, but she said nothing. Always so quiet, always trying not to make a scene. I watched as Ethan flaunted his new connections, laughing loudly with Emma's father, boasting about his future business ventures, acting as if the sacrifices that built him meant nothing. I was just a spectator. Madison an afterthought. It hit me in that moment. hard and cold, that somewhere along the line I had lost my son. Not to marriage, not to love, but to entitlement, greed, and a kind of arrogance I never expected to see in someone I raised. I remember staring at the crystal glasses on the table, thinking about the long nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays. Ethan never thanked me for the second jobs I took to pay for his college tuition, while Madison worked her way through school without complaint. I thought about the home I built, the home I was so eager to pass down, only to realize neither of my children had ever truly called it their safe haven. For Ethan, it was just another asset to claim. I wish I could say I stood up that night and said something, but I didn't. I stayed quiet. I smiled through the humiliation. I let myself believe it was just the wedding stress. That maybe after the honeymoon, Ethan would soften, Madison would forgive, and I could go back to believing I was a good mother who raised decent children. But the ache in my chest didn't fade. It grew. With every passing day, every dismissive comment from Ethan, every exclusion of Madison, I felt it. This tightening coil of regret, guilt, and unspoken anger. And now here I sit, staring at the elegant invitation on my nightstand, the gold-embossed letters spelling out my own son's name, realizing I am not proud. I am broken, and my daughter, who should have been my equal light, has been dimmed because I allowed it to happen. I press a hand to my chest, trying to steady my breathing, but the weight is suffocating. I was so busy raising Ethan to shine, I failed to notice he learned to shine by stealing light from others. Laughter floats through the open window, the sound of caterers setting up the garden ceremony, the clink of glassware being polished for the rehearsal dinner. I close my eyes. I should have seen this coming. I should have seen it years ago. And as that realization sinks deep into my bones, I know one thing for certain. I should have woken up much, much earlier. After Daniel passed away, the world became a storm. I was forced to sail alone. I was 39 when I buried my husband. Still young by most standards, but already worn thin by life. I had 2 children depending on me. Ethan was 11, Madison only 14. They looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes as the soil hit their father's coffin, and in that moment I swore I would protect them from every cruelty the world had to offer. I promised myself I'd keep them safe, comfortable, and loved no matter the cost. In those early years, I threw myself into being everything to them. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, juggling shifts at the diner during the day and cleaning offices at night. My hands were rough. My back ached, but my children never went hungry, never went to school without lunch or supplies. Madison, ever the quiet helper, learned to cook dinner by the time she was 15. She would help with chores, walk Ethan to school, even skipped dances just to ease my burden. I told her she was mature beyond her years, but in truth, I leaned too hard on her. Ethan, on the other hand, was my soft spot. He had Daniel's smile, Daniel's charm, and I clung to those pieces of my late husband like they were life rafts. Whenever Ethan wanted something, I found a way to give it to him. New sneakers when the old ones were still fine. A gaming console when the bills were piling up. Fast food when Madison was carefully portioning our groceries. Every little thing he wanted I somehow made happen, telling myself I was giving him the childhood Daniel would have wanted him to have. I couldn't see the consequences then. I thought I was mothering. I thought I was loving. But really, I was teaching my son a dangerous lesson that affection could be bought, and love was measured in things. As they grew older, the differences between them sharpened. Madison got a part-time job the moment she turned 16. She applied for scholarships, worked double shifts, and saved every penny. She left for college 2 hours away, turning down offers from out-of-state schools just to stay close in case I needed her. I told her she was too independent, too distant, when in reality I was blind to the resentment I had unknowingly planted inside her heart. Ethan stayed home after high school. First, it was I need a break before college, Mom, then. College isn't for everyone, then it was part-time jobs that barely lasted. But his demands only grew. New clothes, a better car weekend, getaways with friends. I didn't think twice before handing over my credit card. I told myself he just needed time to find himself, that it was hard for boys to adjust after losing their father so young. Every time Madison expressed frustration, I snapped at her. He's your little brother, be patient. He's been through enough. I didn't realize then that Madison had been through just as much. Only she learned to bear it in silence. The years slipped by like that. I worked harder, pushed my body further, sacrificed more, all to keep up with Ethan's ever-growing wants. I thought it was love. I thought it was duty. But somewhere along the line it became currency. Ethan's affection was tied to my wallet, and I was too afraid to stop paying for it. Holidays became painful reminders of the imbalance I refused to acknowledge. Madison came home less frequently, often choosing to spend Thanksgiving with friends or traveling with coworkers. I accused her of neglect of being selfish. Family comes first. Madison. I would say, not realizing how hollow it sounded, coming from a mother who only ever prioritized one child. When she did come, she brought gifts, offered to cook, tried to bridge the distance, but the air was always tense. Ethan would show up late, often hungover, empty-handed, but full of opinions. I'd laugh off his crude jokes, excuse his bad manners, blame it on stress or youth, while Madison sat quietly, her eyes hard and tired. Birthdays were no better. Madison would call, sometimes send a modest present she'd chosen with care. Ethan. He'd forget or show up at the last minute with some overpriced gadget, purchased with my own money. I let it slide. I always let it slide. Then came the moments when Ethan didn't bother coming home at all. Christmases where it was just me and a quiet house. Calls that went unanswered. Texts read but ignored. The little boy who used to cling to my hand had grown into a man who treated me like an ATM with a face. I should have seen it for what it was, but I told myself every excuse in the book. He's busy. He's under pressure. He'll come around. Madison tried to talk to me. She tried to show me the patterns, to open my eyes to the way I was being used. But I pushed her away. I told her she was jealous, bitter, too cold-hearted to understand how boys worked. I defended Ethan while dismissing Madison's pain, choosing the fantasy of a doting son over the reality of an indifferent one. As I sit here thinking about the years that slipped through my fingers, I feel the weight of my mistakes settle deep in my bones. I see it all so clearly now. The unbalanced scales, the misplaced loyalty, the way I trained my son to take and trained my daughter to expect nothing. I wanted to believe I was being a good mother. I wanted to believe I was giving Ethan what he needed, but what I gave him was entitlement, and what I took from Madison was fairness. Now, with Ethan's wedding just days away, I feel like I'm attending the final act of a play I unknowingly helped script. I built the stage, painted the backdrop, and watched Ethan step into the spotlight while Madison stood in the shadows. And me, I sat in the audience clapping through the discomfort, too afraid to admit the truth. But I see it now. I see it in the way Ethan talks to me, in the way he excludes Madison, in the way he boasts about his future while draining the last of my savings. I see it in the coldness of his texts, in the hollow promises to catch up soon, in the unreturned calls when I'm sick or need a hand around the house. I see it and I can't unsee it. Maybe it's too late to fix what I broke. Maybe the damage runs too deep. But sitting here thinking about the years I've spent sacrificing for a son who never saw me as anything more than a resource, I feel something I haven't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Anger. Not at Ethan, not even at Madison, but at myself, for letting it get this far. For giving so much of myself that I barely recognize the woman in the mirror anymore. For chasing love that was never truly given back. I glance at the family portrait on my nightstand. Ethan smiling confidently, Madison standing off to the side, me in the center holding them both. A portrait that tells a story far different from the reality. Maybe I can't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, I can stop letting it define me. It happened entirely by accident. 1 week before Ethan's grand wedding, I was simply trying to print a coupon for a grocery run. My old laptop had been acting up, so I grabbed the newer one I had loaned to Ethan a few months earlier. He'd promised it was just temporary. He needed it to finalize wedding contracts, to review real estate listings, to manage some business plans he talked about in passing. I never questioned it. After all, I was the mother, and a mother always trusted her son. As I powered it on, the familiar screen, lit up with his profile still logged in. I should have logged out. I should have just clicked straight to my account and printed what I needed. But something in me hesitated. A strange weight settled in my chest as I saw his emails pop up, notifications fluttering across the screen. And right there, highlighted and unopened, was a subject line I couldn't ignore. Mitchell property transfer. Draft agreement. My heart stalled. My fingers hovered over the mouse before I clicked. Just one click. That's all it took for my world to fracture. The email was from Grant Turner, a name I vaguely recognized, an attorney who once helped me with property tax forms years ago. Grant addressed Ethan as Mr. Mitchell and attached a draft contract titled Voluntary Transfer of Title and Assets. The contract detailed the full transfer of my home. My home? To Ethan's name under the pretense of estate planning. Worse, it included instructions for liquidating my retirement savings, over $200,000, into a joint account set up solely under Ethan's control. A quiet financial disappearance masked as streamlining family assets before the wedding. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mouth went dry, my fingers numb as I scrolled through the back-and-forth correspondence. Ethan had been planning this for months. He told Grant I was old-fashioned, not good with paperwork, and eager to take care of things before the wedding. He even mentioned scheduling a notary to come by the house the day before the ceremony, supposedly to have me sign what I thought were standard family documents. Every polite excuse I'd heard these last few months suddenly sharpened into knives. The calls where Ethan sounded unusually attentive, asking how I was feeling, if I needed any help around the house, offering to help simplify things before the wedding, weren't affection. They were strategy. My son, the boy I raised and sacrificed everything for, was orchestrating a quiet robbery, and I, foolish and blind, had been walking willingly into it. I don't remember closing the laptop, but I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, my heart thudding like a war drum in my ears. All those years of bending over backward to keep Ethan comfortable, of overlooking his disrespect, of ignoring Madison's warnings. They all rushed back, suffocating me. I felt like a fool. More than that, I felt betrayed in the purest, cruelest way imaginable. Tears burned in my eyes, but I forced them back. There was one person who deserved to hear this immediately: Madison. I grabbed my coat, barely bothering to change out of my house slippers, and drove to her small apartment across town. She was surprised to see me, especially in the middle of a workday, but one look at my face, and she ushered me inside. Her home was modest, neat, nothing extravagant. She lived simply, worked hard, always stayed within her means. The contrast between her life and the world Ethan tried to project couldn't have been clearer. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I opened the laptop, pulled up the emails, and turned the screen toward her. Madison sat frozen, reading every line, her knuckles turning white as she clenched her hands in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. I knew he was selfish. But this is theft, Mom. Her words cut through me. I nodded stiffly, feeling shame coil in my stomach. All this time, I thought I was helping him. I thought I was securing his future. Madison leaned back, her eyes distant. It's not just now, Mom. Ethan's been doing this in smaller ways for years. You just didn't want to see it. I blinked. What do you mean? She got up, rifling through a drawer, and returned with a slim folder. Inside were printouts, bank statements, emails, things I had never seen before. Madison pointed to one email addressed to her former supervisor at the design firm where she'd worked 2 years ago. An anonymous complaint filled with baseless accusations about her unethical practices. The timing coincided exactly with when she had been up for a promotion she mysteriously lost. Then there were transaction records showing several online purchases charged to my account that Madison swore she had no knowledge of. Payments for Ethan's luxuries, designer shoes, game consoles, high-end gadgets that were quietly funneled through my bank without my noticing. Madison had tried to track it all, but every time she brought it up, I brushed her off, claiming it must have been a bank error or a forgotten expense. I felt physically ill. Why didn't you tell me more forcefully? I whispered, my voice breaking. Madison's expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes I couldn't bear. I tried, Mom. But every time you defended him, you didn't want to see him that way, so I stopped trying. A part of me wanted to crumble under the weight of guilt. Another part of me wanted to scream. But mostly a strange calm began to take root. A calm fueled by years of overlooked injustice, of misplaced trust, of a mother's blindness, finally cleared. Ethan wasn't just stealing from me. He had stolen from Madison, too. Her opportunities, her peace of mind, her relationship with her own mother. And all because I allowed it. For years I thought I was keeping the family together by appeasing Ethan. But I had been feeding a wolf while letting my daughter fend for herself in the cold. I straightened my spine. I won't let him take one more thing from us, I said quietly. Madison searched my face for a moment, as if gauging whether this was another fleeting moment of disappointment or something deeper. When she saw the resolve, her shoulders relaxed just slightly. What are you going to do, Mom? I closed the laptop with a soft click, my mind already forming a plan. I'm going to his wedding, I said firmly, but not to celebrate. I'm going to make sure everyone sees Ethan for who he really is. And for the first time in a long, long while, I didn't feel powerless. I felt alive. That night, sleep became a stranger to me. I lay in bed, the silence of my house pressing in like a heavy blanket, suffocating and cold. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face as a little boy tugging at my apron, asking for another bedtime story. And then just as quickly it shifted to the man who was plotting to take away everything I had worked for, my home, my savings, my peace. The betrayal felt like an open wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. I paced the kitchen as dawn crept over the horizon. The walls of this house, the same walls that had witnessed my years of sacrifice, felt unfamiliar, like I had been living in a lie. How many meals had I cooked in this kitchen for a son who only saw me as a stepping stone? How many bills had I paid while he planned to drain me dry? My hands trembled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't face this alone. I needed someone who wasn't blinded by years of maternal instinct. Someone who could help me fight back with clarity and strength. There was only one person who came to mind. Edith Brooks. Edith had been my friend for over 3 decades. She wasn't the kind of friend who sugarcoated things. Edith was sharp as a tack, a retired paralegal with more common sense than half the people I knew combined. She had raised her kids with firm love and lived on her own terms after her husband passed. I trusted her more than anyone. I called her early that morning, my voice cracking as I explained the situation. She didn't hesitate. "Come over, bring every document you have. We'll figure this out together," she said, calm and commanding. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting at her dining table surrounded by a sea of papers. Bank statements, old emails, payment receipts I had retrieved from my email account, and those horrifying legal drafts Ethan had prepared. Edith's sharp eyes scanned everything with a precision that left no detail unnoticed. When I finished explaining everything, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a long sigh. "This isn't just about money, Florence," she said. "This is about respect, about dignity. He's been chipping away at yours for years, and now he's going for the final blow." I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in my throat. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was protecting him. Edith's gaze softened slightly. "You did what you thought was right, but now you have to do what's necessary. You can't save a child who's decided to be a predator." Her words hit me like a cold slap, but it was what I needed. The sugarcoating was gone. The excuses were gone. For the first time, I saw Ethan not as my little boy, but as a man who had grown into someone I barely recognized. I asked Edith if I should confront him before the wedding, sit him down and force him to explain himself. She shook her head firmly. "Confronting him in private will only give him time to twist the story, to manipulate you like he always has. You said it yourself. He's charming. He'll cry, he'll make promises, and you'll walk out feeling guilty for even asking questions. No, Florence, this time you confront him with the whole room watching. Let everyone see him for who he is, especially his future in-laws. It made sense. A private confrontation would only end with me being gaslighted and walked over again. But if I did it publicly with undeniable proof, he couldn't run, couldn't hide behind lies. Edith helped me outline a plan. Step 1, gather every shred of evidence. I spent the next 2 days combing through years of emails, digging up old bank records, tracking every unexplained charge on my credit cards. I printed text messages I had ignored where Ethan asked for urgent help with bills that in reality had gone straight into weekend trips or designer clothes. Madison helped me piece it together, her quiet resolve lending me strength. She dug through her own archives, finding emails from job recruiters she was mysteriously ghosted by. Turns out Ethan had been contacting people behind her back. She found screenshots from mutual friends who had quietly unfriended her after hearing false stories that Ethan had planted. Each piece of evidence was a fresh stab to my chest, but it also fueled my determination. I wasn't just fighting for my bank account anymore. I was fighting for every year I spent bending over backward, for every insult my daughter swallowed, for every sleepless night I justified Ethan's disrespect. Edith introduced me to a trusted lawyer. She knew someone who could ensure that if Ethan tried to move against me before the wedding, legal barriers were in place to stop him. We froze the suspicious accounts, placed alerts on property transfers, and prepared cease and desist letters just in case. I felt myself changing. The fragile woman who tiptoed around her son's moods was gone. In her place stood a woman rediscovering her backbone, remembering the strength it took to raise 2 children alone, to survive widowhood, to build a life from ashes. I looked in the mirror on the 3rd night, and though my face was tired, my eyes were clear. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of losing Ethan's love, because I realized it had been conditional all along. I wasn't afraid of public shame, because there was no shame in demanding dignity. And I certainly wasn't afraid of standing alone, because I knew now that I had always stood alone while pretending I wasn't. No more. Ethan wouldn't take one more piece of me. Not my home, not my money, not my dignity. And come his wedding day, he would learn that the woman he dismissed as a pushover had finally remembered how to stand tall. The morning of Ethan's wedding arrived with the kind of crisp, golden sunlight that should have made everything feel magical. But as I stepped onto the perfectly manicured grounds of the Wallace estate, all I felt was the sharp bite of exclusion, like a quiet, persistent wind pressing against my chest. The grand white tent was already up rows of pristine chairs lined with ivory sashes, staff members moving briskly, setting up tables and arranging flowers that probably cost more than my monthly pension. I arrived early, more out of habit than obligation. I had spent a lifetime being the first one in and the last one out whenever Ethan needed something. I had assumed naively that on his most important day there would be some role for me to play, some moment to feel like I belonged. But the first person who greeted me was a young woman in a clipboard and headset who didn't even bother to smile. She barely looked me in the eye before flipping through her seating chart and asking, "Are you one of the staff, or here for guest check-in?" I had to steady my voice as I answered, "I'm the groom's mother." Her expression didn't change. No warmth, no acknowledgement, just a quick, tight nod before she pointed to a small table near the entrance. "Mr. Mitchell asked if you could help at the welcome table for early arrivals," she said briskly, already turning away to bark orders at the catering crew. I stood there, stunned, clutching the strap of my purse, feeling like I had been slapped. Help at the welcome table, like an usher, like an employee. I tried to tell myself it was just a misunderstanding, that Ethan had probably meant it as a way to involve me, but the knot forming in my stomach told me better. I walked over to the welcome table where a pair of teenage interns were taping down seating cards. My name was nowhere on the printed itinerary, not listed among the speakers, not in the main family seating chart. I wasn't mentioned in the program notes, wasn't acknowledged in any of the beautifully printed materials that adorned every surface. There was a biography about the Wallace family, a full spread about Emma and her parents' philanthropic work, even a section dedicated to Ethan's professional journey, which I knew was largely fabricated. And me, nothing, Not a line, not even a mention. Madison arrived about an hour later. She looked beautiful, understated, in a deep navy dress she had bought herself on clearance. She smiled when she saw me, but there was something distant in her eyes, like she already knew the game we were being forced to play. When she checked in at the reception desk, I watched the young woman point her toward the outer tables somewhere near the back of the tent. "Table 13, the woman had said with a shrug, like she was announcing a raffle number, not the assigned seating for the sister of the groom. I followed Madison inside, hoping it was all just a simple mistake. But when we entered the main hall, the picture became painfully clear. The Wallace family occupied the front rows, surrounded by their circle of high-profile guests. Politicians, corporate executives, and socialites. The Mitchell family, such as it was, had been pushed to the far edges of the celebration. I looked around, expecting at least a small reserved table for immediate family, but there was none. I walked over to the head usher and asked softly, "Excuse me, I don't see my daughter's name on the bridal party photos list." He scanned the sheet quickly before replying, "Oh, Madison, she's not part of the main photos. Only bridal party and VIP family are included." VIP family. I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, parents of the bride, bride and groom, godparents and grandparents from the Wallace side. I stood frozen, unable to process the words. Madison stood a few feet away, watching the exchange unfold. Her shoulders square, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. She didn't say a word, but her eyes said everything. She had been through this before. She expected this. I hadn't. And that was my failure. For years I had told myself that all the sacrifices I made were for Ethan's success, for his happiness. I had swallowed every slight ignored, every warning defended, every cruel moment, because I thought in the end my place as his mother was untouchable. But in that moment, standing among strangers who didn't know me at an event I had helped finance it, became painfully obvious. I was not a mother in my son's eyes. I was a tool, a name on a check. A shadow to be hidden away when it was inconvenient. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, the lump forming in my throat, but I didn't allow myself to cry. I glanced at Madison, at her brave, exhausted smile, at the tight way she clutched her small purse like it was the only armor she had left. I had spent decades trying to buy Ethan's love with sacrifices. I had spent decades convincing Madison to be patient, to forgive, to accept scraps of attention. And here we were. Both of us discarded, publicly humiliated, made invisible in a celebration that should have been about family. And suddenly I was no longer sad. I was no longer ashamed. I was angry. But more than that, I was awake. I watched Emma strut through the venue like a queen, barely acknowledging me with a cursory nod. I watched Ethan laugh with the Wallaces, boasting about new business connections, flashing a smile that no longer seemed innocent or charming. I watched the photographers ignore Madison. The guests breeze past me as if I were part of the scenery. In that instant, something inside me shifted. A lifetime of being quiet, forgiving. Accommodating cracked open. I straightened my back. My fingers stopped trembling. No more. I had stayed silent too long, allowed this false narrative of a perfect son, a perfect wedding, a perfect family, to continue far too long. But that silence was about to end. As I stood there, surrounded by wealth pretense, and people who only valued me for what I could give, I knew what I needed to do. Not for revenge, not for theatrics, but for Madison, for myself, for every mother who ever lost her voice in the noise of other people's selfishness. I wasn't going to whisper anymore. I was going to make sure the world heard me. The ballroom was dressed in the kind of extravagance that could make your head spin. Gold-rimmed plates that probably cost more than my first car crystal glasses that glistened like stars under the grand chandeliers, and centerpieces so tall and elaborate you couldn't even see the person sitting across from you. Everything was curated to perfection, designed to impress, to show the world that Ethan Mitchell had arrived. That he was successful, important, worthy of the Wallace name. I sat at my assigned table, which was placed strategically near the kitchen entrance, far enough from the head table to be forgotten, but close enough to watch the stage Ethan had built for himself. Around me were polite smiles, occasional nods from guests who didn't know me, didn't care to know me. The Wallaces paraded through the room like royalty, their postures stiff, their voices full of self-importance. Emma moved with the grace of a woman who believed she had married up completely, unaware that the empire she thought she was stepping into was built on the quiet suffering of the very woman seated in the shadows. Me. The ceremony had been grand, sure. The vows rehearsed, the tears perfectly timed, the applause generous, but as the evening crept into toasts and dancing, I felt the weight of every injustice pressing down on me. I glanced over at Madison, who had been tucked away at the outer tables, away from photographers, away from any attention. She caught my gaze and gave me a small knowing nod, as if reminding me that tonight wasn't about enduring in silence. It was about standing tall. When the master of ceremonies called for toasts, the crowd's chatter quieted. A few Wallaces took turns boasting about family legacy, about business conquests. Emma's father spoke glowingly about his new son-in-law, about how proud they were to welcome him into their distinguished family. Lies layered upon lies, and the crowd lapped it up like fine wine. Then I heard my name. And now Mrs. Florence Mitchell. The groom's mother would like to say a few words, the MC announced. Ethan didn't expect this. I could see it in the way his smile faltered, in the quick glance he threw toward the Wallaces. He hadn't approved this, hadn't arranged it. For a brief moment, I saw panic flash in his eyes. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of my years and my choices settle on my shoulders, but my spine was straighter than it had been in decades. I walked up to the microphone, each step firm, deliberate. The room watched, curious, some perhaps expecting sentimental praise, a few likely hoping for some touching, motherly moment to round out the night. I reached for my glass of champagne, raised it high, and took a steadying breath. To my son, Ethan Mitchell, I began, my voice clear and unwavering. To the boy I raised for 34 years, the boy I loved with every ounce of my being, the boy I sacrificed my health, my finances, and my peace for. Tonight I was told to deliver a toast, words of celebration, of joy, of approval. I paused, letting my gaze sweep the room. Some guests smiled politely. Some nodded. Others seemed a little confused. I continued. And I will deliver a toast. I said, my voice turning sharper, more deliberate. But it will not be one of empty praise, It will be one of truth. The air in the room shifted. The polite smiles faded, replaced with curious frowns. I turned slightly toward the Wallaces, ensuring my voice carried. For years I said I believed my job was to give and give to ensure my son had every opportunity to shine. I turned a blind eye when he belittled his sister Madison. I excused his entitlement. I paid his debts. I silenced my instincts, thinking it was love. I taught him that love meant unlimited forgiveness. I taught him that a mother's sacrifices had no limits. A ripple moved through the crowd, whispers spreading like wildfire, and I was repaid for those sacrifices. I pressed on, not with respect, not with gratitude, but with deception, with theft, with betrayal. I could see Ethan shifting in his chair, face turning pale. Emma blinked rapidly, her grip tightening around her wineglass. I held up a small folder, pulling out the printed contract with Ethan's signature. This, I said, lifting it high, is a draft legal document written at my son's request with the intention of transferring my home, my only home, into his name without my informed consent, along with draining $200,000 from my retirement savings to fund a lifestyle built on illusion. Gasps rang out, a collective sound of shock vibrating through the opulent hall. Cameras clicked, people leaned in. And Madison. I turned toward my daughter, who sat stunned, was not only excluded from this celebration, but has endured years of sabotage from her own brother. Promotions, ruined reputations, attacked all, so Ethan could build a facade of success on the backs of the very people who loved him the most. Emma's wineglass slipped from her hand, crashing onto the marble floor. Guests began murmuring, louder, chairs scraping as some shifted uncomfortably. The Wallaces exchanged alarmed glances, their polished masks beginning to crack. I locked eyes with Emma, holding nothing back. "And to you, Emma Wallace. My son promised you a life of comfort, a home in the prestigious neighborhoods, grand investments in your future. But let me make this clear, the luxury condo he boasted about doesn't belong to him. The down payment came from my pension, the renovations charged to my accounts, and the title remains in my name." Emma's mouth opened, but no words came out. I set my glass down gently, feeling calm for the first time in years. Tonight, this room was meant to celebrate a union built on love, trust, and family values. But what you're actually witnessing is the unveiling of deceit, manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked entitlement. I stepped back from the microphone, my hands steady, my heart finally at ease. "I raised my glass tonight," I said, my voice softer, but no less commanding, not to toast a future built on lies, but to reclaim my dignity, and to honor the daughter who stood in the shadows for far too long. And with that I walked away, leaving behind a room in stunned silence, and a son who no longer had the power to break me. For a moment the grand ballroom stood frozen, in stunned silence. The echoes of shattered glass mingled with the faint hum of the string quartet in the distance. But all eyes were locked on me. Then, like a dam breaking, the chaos began. Ethan stood up so abruptly his chair clattered to the floor behind him. His face was flushed red, not from shame, but from anger and panic. "That's not true!" he shouted, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, throwing tantrums. "This is nonsense. Lies. She's twisting everything." But the crowd wasn't buying it. I could see the shift in the room. The Wallaces looking at one another with widening eyes, Emma's face turning pale as she backed away from the head table, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. Her father, Charles Wallace, was already pulling his phone from his pocket, scrolling quickly through something, probably the loan documents he had previously praised Ethan for handling so efficiently. Caroline Wallace, who had barely acknowledged me all evening, now looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. Emma's hands shook as she grabbed her clutch and stumbled out from behind the table, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor as she rushed toward the exit, ignoring Ethan's desperate calls after her. Emma, don't listen to her. It's not like that. You don't understand what's going on." But Emma didn't even glance back. The grand doors closed behind her, leaving the rest of us standing in the growing wreckage of a celebration turned disaster. Ethan's gaze swung back to me, wild, unhinged. "You planned this. You ambushed me in front of everyone. This was supposed to be my day." His fists clenched his chest, heaving like a spoiled child caught red-handed. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than any words I could offer. Madison stood slowly from her table, her eyes glossy, her chin trembling. She hadn't said a word during my speech, hadn't made a scene or demanded attention. But now I saw something I hadn't seen in her in years. Release. Her breath hitched, a quiet sob escaping her lips before she wiped it away with the back of her hand. And then through the tears came a small, incredulous smile. For the first time in a long time, my daughter knew she wasn't standing alone. I was beside her, not defending Ethan, not making excuses, but standing firmly, unapologetically by her side. Ethan looked around the room, searching for allies, but they weren't there. Guests murmured among themselves, some discreetly slipping out, others recording the scene on their phones. The Wallaces huddled together, stiff and embarrassed, their expressions a blend of betrayal and humiliation. The aura of prestige Ethan had so carefully constructed was collapsing in real time, and there was no one rushing to save him. As I turned to walk away, I gave a small nod to Edith Brooks, who had positioned herself strategically at the edge of the crowd, documents in hand. With a quiet efficiency only Edith could manage, she approached the head of security for the venue and handed over a legal notice. Her voice was calm, professional, but firm enough for those nearby to hear. Florence Mitchell, as the legal owner of the Mitchell residence and associated assets, hereby serves notice of asset protection. Effective immediately, all properties in her name are frozen pending further legal review. Any attempts at unauthorized transfer or access will be met with criminal prosecution." The guard nodded already, speaking into his earpiece, while Ethan's face twisted in disbelief. You can't do this. You can't just freeze everything." I glanced over my shoulder, my voice steady, my back straighter than it had felt in years. "Oh, but I can..." "And I did." Ethan made a move toward me as if to plead or maybe to threaten, I couldn't quite tell. But before he could speak, Madison stepped between us, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Don't you dare," she said, her tone laced with years of bottled-up hurt. "You've taken enough from her. From both of us." Ethan's jaw clenched, his entire frame trembling. But this time there was nowhere left for him to run, no one left to manipulate. No sympathetic ears, no forgiving mother shielding him from consequences. Edith handed me a small envelope. Documents signed and sealed that morning at her office, ensuring my accounts were protected, my home secured, my future reclaimed. I tucked them neatly into my handbag, feeling the weight of years of guilt lift from my shoulders. Without another word, I walked toward the doors, Madison matching my stride, her head held high. I didn't look back, but I could hear the noise building behind me. Guests whispering, some angrily confronting Ethan, others calling rides to leave early, the Wallaces demanding explanations. The polished illusion Ethan had so desperately clung to was crumbling like a poorly built house of cards. Each truth I had spoken, pulling another block from the base. As Madison and I reached the exit, the fresh evening air hit my face like a balm, cool and refreshing after the suffocating falseness of that ballroom. I took a long, deep breath, savoring the freedom, the finality of it all. A young valet jogged up with Madison's modest car, looking a little confused as to why the mother of the groom and his sister were leaving mid-reception. Madison handed him a tip with a smile, and I slid into the passenger seat, feeling lighter than I had in decades. Ethan's voice echoed faintly from within the building, desperate, angry, lost. I didn't care. For once, it wasn't my job to clean up his mess. It wasn't my burden to shoulder. As we pulled away from the glowing estate, leaving behind the ruins of deceit and betrayal, I glanced at Madison and squeezed her hand. "You okay?" I asked softly. She nodded, blinking back tears. "Better than okay." And for the first time in a very long time, so was I. In the weeks after the wedding, my house, once a place of suffocating silence and old ghosts, felt lighter. The walls didn't close in anymore. The air wasn't stale with memories of obligations and regrets. For the first time in my life, the home that had been my prison slowly became my sanctuary. But I knew it wouldn't last. I didn't want it to. I was done with big empty spaces that only echoed loneliness and sacrifice. I was done carrying the weight of a life that wasn't mine anymore. So I made a decision. I sat down with Madison over a quiet breakfast, the morning sun spilling through the kitchen window, and told her I was selling the house. Her eyes widened at first, a flicker of surprise dancing across her features, but it quickly settled into understanding. I explained how I wanted to close that chapter, how the house had become a monument to years of misplaced loyalty, how I was tired of dusting off memories that only hurt me. We listed the house within a month. There were tears. Of course there were. A lifetime of raising 2 children, of scraped knees and birthday parties, of cold winter nights by the fire, all attached to that home. But as each room was cleared, as each box was packed, I felt a little more of the old weight slide off my shoulders. The sale went quickly, more than I expected, and with the money I did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I bought a small cottage on the edge of town, modest, charming, just enough for me to live comfortably. And more importantly, I invested in something Madison and I had always joked about, but never seriously considered. Together, we opened a small cafe tucked into a quiet neighborhood near the park, with a simple but honest name, New Beginnings. It wasn't just a business. It was therapy. It was joy. It was something that belonged to us, untouched by manipulation, free from guilt. Madison handled the menu, curated the best pastries and fresh lunches. I managed the front, chatting with customers, learning names, remembering favorite orders. There was something beautiful about serving people smiles with their morning coffee. Something healing about waking up and knowing your day was yours to design. Madison blossomed. I could see the layers of old resentment melt away as we spent our days together. Not as mother and daughter forced into an uneven relationship, but as partners. Equals. Friends. We laughed more. We talked about things we never had time to talk about before. She told me about her dreams of starting a small gardening club. I told her about my love for knitting I had ignored for years. For the first time, we both had space to breathe, to enjoy the simple moments we were so often robbed of. Meanwhile, life outside our little cafe continued, though the tides had shifted dramatically. I didn't have to chase after justice anymore. The truth was its own weapon, and it had already cut through the lies Ethan built his life on. Emma officially called off the marriage days after the wedding disaster. Her parents, furious over the humiliation and financial deceit, filed formal complaints not just with their social circles but with their legal advisors. The Wallaces demanded restitution for the funds Ethan had fraudulently acquired in the months leading up to the wedding, and when they realized how deeply he had misrepresented his financial standing, they threatened legal action. Ethan's facade crumbled. Without the safety net of my savings, without the artificial image of wealth, he was left stranded. The condo was sold, the fancy car repossessed. Friends who orbited him for access to the Wallaces vanished. Business contacts disappeared. The more he tried to salvage his image, the faster it fell apart. There were no more easy escapes, no more motherly rescue plans waiting to clean up his messes. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. Watching from a distance, I felt nothing. No satisfaction in his downfall, no revenge-filled pride, just clarity. Justice didn't always have to roar. Sometimes it worked quietly in the background as you moved on and built something beautiful. Madison and I created a rhythm. Morning walks before opening coffee tastings, slow afternoons chatting with regulars. Our days were simple but full. I finally learned what it meant to live a life not dictated by other people's expectations. I wasn't someone's meal ticket, someone's emotional punching bag, someone's last-minute safety net. I was Florence Mitchell, strong, free, and finally living life on my own terms. People often stopped me at the cafe to chat, sometimes to ask about the scandal, other times just to exchange recipes or stories about their grandchildren. I never went into details. I didn't need to. My life spoke for itself. The quiet glow on Madison's face, the cozy warmth of new beginnings, the peace in my own chest, all proof enough that I was no longer someone's shadow. Ethan called a few times in the first few months. I let them go to voicemail. I listened more out of curiosity than concern. His messages shifted from anger to pleas, then finally to silence. I never called back. I knew that voice too well, the one that promised change but always demanded something in return. I didn't have room for that anymore. I wasn't cruel. I didn't need to be. Life had a way of correcting itself when you stopped interfering. I didn't have to punish Ethan. His own choices did that. I didn't have to destroy his future. He had been slowly sabotaging himself for years. All I did was stop enabling it. And in doing so, I finally gave myself permission to heal. The freedom was intoxicating. The laughter came easier. The mornings felt lighter. The nights were peaceful. And every time I locked up new beginnings, every time I hugged Madison goodbye after a day well spent, every time I stepped into my cozy little cottage, I smiled to myself and thought, this is what life was supposed to feel like all along. It was a warm afternoon when Madison and I walked past the little corner shop for the first time. The sign above it was old and faded, the windows dusty, the space inside empty and forgotten. Yet as we stood there staring through the glass, I could see something light up in Madison's eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. Hope, quiet excitement, the soft glow of possibility. "This would be perfect for a flower shop," she said under her breath, almost afraid to say it aloud. And in that moment, I knew. I had spent years draining my energy on people who only took investing in someone who had no intention of ever giving back. I had sacrificed too much for the wrong child. But now I had a chance to do it right. not by giving out of guilt or obligation, but by supporting someone who truly deserved it. Within a week, I contacted the property owner, scheduled a viewing, and signed the papers. Madison cried when I handed her the keys. She hugged me so tightly I felt her whole body tremble, and I realized then just how much she had carried alone all these years. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't demanded attention. She had quietly endured, quietly built herself back up. And now it was her turn to bloom. We named it Bloom and Branch. Madison poured her heart into it, designing the cozy interior, choosing every flower with care, setting up workshops for local kids and elderly women who wanted to learn floral arrangements. The shop smelled like fresh roses and eucalyptus, and it quickly became the heart of our little neighborhood. Every time I walked in, I felt pride swelling in my chest, not just for the beautiful flowers, but for the woman my daughter had become. She was strong, patient, kind, the best parts of me untouched by bitterness. At Bloom and Branch, I watched Madison laugh again. I saw her connect with people, build friendships, create beauty with her own two hands. She thrived in that little shop, and every petal, every arrangement felt like a testament to her resilience. While Madison built her dream, I quietly started building mine, one I had never dared to imagine when I was drowning in Ethan's demands. I signed up for my first community class at the age of 64, a simple workshop for women on rediscovering purpose after retirement. At first, I sat in the back of the room, unsure if I even belonged there. But as the weeks passed, I found myself speaking up, sharing my story, listening to other women who had also given too much of themselves to ungrateful children, inattentive spouses, or unsatisfying careers. I attended lectures on financial independence workshops, on travel for women, over 60 classes on mindfulness and self-care. I joined a local walking group, found a few friends who enjoyed quiet Saturday brunches and evening book clubs. Slowly, my life expanded beyond the four walls of my house, beyond the roles that had defined me for so long. I started knitting again, something I hadn't done since Madison was little. I planted a small herb garden by my kitchen window. I even dared to sign up for a weekend retreat upstate, something the old Florence would have deemed selfish or unnecessary. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was learning to take up space in my own life, learning that my happiness didn't have to come second. There were moments, of course, when the old guilt crept in. Small pangs of what if I had done better or what if I had balanced things differently. But I learned not to linger in those moments. I learned to acknowledge them, then let them pass like clouds overhead. Because the truth was, I had done the best I could with what I knew back then, and now I knew better. I could choose differently. At Bloom and Branch, Madison always saved a spot for me by the window. A little reading nook with a soft chair and a side table for my tea. Sometimes I'd spend hours there just watching her greet customers, help little kids pick out flowers for their mothers, or help older men choose the perfect anniversary bouquet. She moved with ease, with grace, with a quiet confidence that made my heart swell. One evening after the shop closed, Madison and I sat in that corner together, sipping tea, looking out at the dusky sky. "You know, Mom," she said softly, "I used to wonder if I would ever matter to you the way Ethan did." Her words cut deep, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my cup. "Madison, I didn't see it then, but I see it now. You have always mattered. You were the one holding me together while I was too blind to notice. I will never make the mistake of not seeing you again." She smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know, Mom. I know." We sat there in silence, two women healing side by side, each letting go of years of pain and misunderstanding. That night, as I drove home to my little cottage, I reflected on how far I had come. I had spent too many years measuring my worth by how much I could give, how much I could endure. But now I understood. My worth was not defined by sacrifice. It was reflected in joy, in peace, in simple moments of contentment. I had not lost my family. I had rediscovered it in Madison's laughter, in my newfound friendships, in the quiet satisfaction of choosing myself without apology. I was no longer just Florence the mother. I was Florence the woman, the friend, the dreamer. And my daughter, she wasn't a shadow to a selfish brother anymore. She was the brightest flower in my garden, and she deserved every bit of love I could finally give her. I stopped counting how many months had passed since I last heard Ethan's voice. The calls came at first frequently, then sporadically, then they simply stopped. I never answered. I listened to the voicemails not out of longing, but to remind myself why I had made the choices I did. Each message followed the same tired rhythm. First excuses, then guilt, then anger, and finally desperation. But I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say, and more importantly, there was nothing left to give. The silence wasn't painful. It was liberating. For the first time in my life, I understood that distance from toxicity wasn't abandonment. It was self-respect. I didn't owe him forgiveness wrapped in sacrifice. I didn't owe him comfort built on my continued suffering. The only thing I owed myself was peace. So I embraced it, fully. I filled my mornings with things that nourished me. Long walks by the river, fresh coffee at Bloom and Branch, warm chats with Madison before we opened the cafe doors to our little community. I found rhythm in simplicity, contentment in things I had always brushed aside. I picked up hobbies I had shelved for decades, enrolled in art classes, learned to make fresh pasta from scratch, joined a book club. I was no longer the woman watching life pass by while catering to someone else's whims. I was present in my own life fully unapologetically. Madison thrived in her world and I thrived in mine, but more beautifully we shared so much of it together. Bloom and Branch blossomed into a hub of joy, a space where laughter was more common than sighs, where people gathered to find warmth and beauty. We didn't talk about Ethan much anymore. There was no bitterness, no need for angry words. Just quiet acceptance that not every relationship deserves a seat at your table, even if it shares your blood. And then came the day we opened the doors to our second little dream. Our cafe nestled right next to the flower shop. We called it Kindred, a place built on everything we had learned: community, honesty, dignity. Madison baked fresh pastries each morning and I manned the register, knowing nearly every customer by name. We built something from the ashes of betrayal, something strong, something real. The opening day was simple, just close friends, loyal customers, and a few of our favorite neighbors. No grand speeches, no extravagant decorations, just authenticity. But when it came time to cut the ribbon, I felt a tug in my heart, a need to say something, not for Ethan, not for the world, but for myself. I stood at the little corner of the cafe, holding a cup of steaming coffee in my hand, looking at familiar faces who had cheered me on through every stumble. Madison stood beside me, beaming, her hand lightly resting on my shoulder. I took a slow breath and let the words rise, not rehearsed, but straight from my heart. Family. I began, my voice steady, is a word that gets thrown around so easily. People will tell you it means blood, it means obligation, it means sacrifice. For a long time I believed that. I believed family meant enduring every disappointment, accepting every hurt, staying silent, even when my heart was breaking. The room quieted, every eye on me, every ear leaning in. But life taught me something else. I continued. Family isn't where you go to be hurt. It's not where you trade your peace for someone else's comfort. Salam. Family, real family, is where you're seen, where you're valued, where you are loved for exactly who you are. I glanced at Madison, pride blooming in my chest, then back at the small group before me. Today isn't just about opening a cafe. It's about opening a new chapter. It's about reminding ourselves that we can choose who we surround ourselves with. We can choose joy, we can choose dignity, and we can choose to only keep people close who bring light into our lives. I paused, letting the warmth settle in my chest, the final piece of my healing clicking into place. I used to be a mother, drowning in sacrifice, I said softly. Today, I am a woman fully alive in her own life. The room erupted in quiet applause, soft claps filled with understanding and compassion, not just for my words, but for the journey behind them. Madison squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening with quiet pride, and I knew we had built something more than a cafe. We had built a home for our hearts. Later that evening, as we locked up the cozy lights of kindred, casting a soft glow on the sidewalk, Madison wrapped her arm around mine and whispered, "You're really happy, aren't you, Mom?" I smiled, a genuine, full smile that felt like sunlight in my soul. "I am," I whispered back. "I am." And I meant every word. If you've ever found yourself giving everything to people who only took more, if you've ever been made to feel invisible in your own family, just know you are not alone. I learned far later than I wish I had that sometimes the hardest but most powerful thing you can do is to choose yourself. Have you ever had to make that choice? To walk away from people who were supposed to love you, but only left you drained and broken? I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Your words might help someone else feel a little less alone. And if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own strength, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. Here we share stories about quiet strength, second chances, and finding peace after the storm. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's never too late to reclaim your worth.